Okay, let's just jump right in. You've seen the headlines, right? You hear the stories, acts of violence, things that look like oppression, and they seem constantly linked to Islam in the news. And it's natural to ask that really tough question that keeps coming up. Does the religion itself actually promote this? Sitting here today, July 4th, 2025, these images, these narratives, they can cause real fear. So asking that question isn't just fair, it feels necessary. But what if the answer isn't just a simple yes or no? What if it's more complicated?
Yeah, that's what we want to do in this deep dive. We want to try and cut through some of that noise. We'll try to separate the core scripture from what empires or individuals or even extremist groups have done throughout history. Was the violence we read about really driven by Islamic teachings, or was it more about, you know, the usual suspects in human history, politics, power, economics, maybe just ambition? So, by looking closely at the texts, the context they came from, and the history around them, we're hoping to find a more honest truth. Okay, let's get into it. It's a challenging topic, no doubt, but really important.
So one of the first things that always comes up, this idea that Islam was sped by the sword. It paints this picture, doesn't it? Like Arab horsemen charging across continents, making people convert or face death. And look, it's undeniable the early Muslim conquests were incredibly fast. They built huge empires very quickly. But here's where it gets really interesting when you dig a bit deeper. Was conversion really the main goal?
Right, that image is incredibly persistent, but the historical evidence, it paints a very different picture. The core thing to grasp here is that Islamic scripture itself actually forbids forcing people to convert. There's a specific verse in the Qur'an, it's quite famous, Surah 2, Ayah 256, and it says, "Let there be no compulsion in religion, for the truth stands out clearly from falsehood." And for centuries, the vast majority of scholars have understood that as a clear, fundamental rule. You cannot force conversion. So this whole idea of armies riding out specifically to make people become Muslim, it just doesn't quite fit with that core teaching.
Wow, okay. No compulsion in religion. That's pretty direct. But then, if forcing conversion wasn't the main objective, especially during those really rapid early conquests, what was driving them? What were these new empires actually trying to achieve on the ground?
That's the key question. And the historical consensus points towards more, let's say, pragmatic goals. Things like establishing political control, gaining territory, consolidating resources and wealth. The kinds of things empires throughout history have always been interested in. And crucially, not primarily focused on forcing religious change on the entire population. We see real examples of this. Non-Muslims living in these new empires, Christians, Jews, even Zoroastrians, particularly in places like Persia, they were often allowed to keep their faith. They usually paid a special tax, the jizya,
Ah, yes, I've heard of that.
right? And it wasn't like a punishment for not being Muslim. It was understood as a fee in return for religious freedom and the state's protection. They could run their own communities, follow their own laws and personal matters. And in fact, many of these non-Muslim communities really flourished for centuries within Muslim-ruled lands. They were vital parts of the economy, the culture, intellectual life.
That's a really important point. It completely changes the dynamic from coercion to something more like, well, accommodation, maybe. So if conversion wasn't forced, how did Islam eventually become the dominant faith in so many of these areas? It didn't happen overnight then.
Absolutely not overnight. It was actually a very slow, gradual process. In many regions, Muslims didn't become the majority for centuries after the initial conquest, sometimes not until the 11th century or even later. This suggests that conversion happened organically over time, maybe through intermarriage, through trade. Sometimes people saw social or economic advantages in converting, like not having to pay the jizya or wanting to be part of the ruling culture. But it indicates a slow, peaceful spread of the faith itself, quite distinct from the military expansion of the empire.
So the empire expands quickly, but the religion spreads slowly.
Exactly. And the most striking example, perhaps, is Indonesia. Today it has the world's largest Muslim population. But it was never conquered by Muslim armies. Islam arrived there peacefully, over centuries, carried by traders, merchants, and Sufi teachers.
That completely undermines the simple spread by the sword idea.
It really does. It shows you have to separate the political project of empire building from the way the religion itself spread in many places. It's much more nuanced.
Okay, that gives us a lot to think about regarding the early spread. Now, let's shift gears to another really loaded term, jihad. You hear this word, and for many people, especially in the West, it immediately means holy war. Extremist groups certainly use it that way to justify horrific violence. It's become such a divisive word. So how do we unpack what jihad really means? How do we understand its true intent versus how it's sometimes used today?
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. And the first step is language.
Mhm.
In Arabic, the word jihad literally just means to struggle or to strive. It's a very broad concept, and traditionally Islamic thought talks about two main kinds of jihad. There's what's often called the greater jihad, and many scholars consider this the most important one. This is the internal personal struggle. The struggle against your own ego, against greed, against negative thoughts, against injustice within yourself. It's about striving to be a better person, a more ethical person, living according to God's will. It's a lifelong spiritual effort.
Okay, so the greater jihad is primarily internal spiritual self-improvement. But then there's the other one, the lesser jihad, which is the one associated with fighting. How does that work? What are the rules around it? Because that's where the controversy really lies for many people.
Exactly. The lesser jihad can involve physical struggle, yes, but this is critical. It comes with very strict conditions and rules. It's much closer to what we might call a just war theory in the West. And you absolutely have to understand the historical context when permission for physical fighting was first given. It wasn't some command to go out and attack everyone. It came only after years of intense persecution of the first Muslims in Mecca. They were tortured, killed, boycotted, and eventually forced to flee their homes, leaving everything behind just to survive. It was in that context of self-defense against active aggression that permission to fight back was granted.
So it was defensive in origin.
Primarily, yes. The Qur'an says, for instance, in Surah 2, Ayah 190, "Fight in the way of God with those who fight you, but do not transgress." God does not love the aggressor. See that condition. Do not transgress. It emphasizes limits. And this verse, along with others urging peace if the enemy stops fighting, form the basis for classical Islamic law's detailed rules of engagement.
Okay, so like a just war theory. What kind of rules did that involve? Was it just about who you could fight or also how?
Both. The classical rules are quite specific. They explicitly forbid targeting non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, monks, priests, anyone not directly fighting. They also forbid unnecessary destruction, like cutting down fruit trees, destroying crops, poisoning wells, or harming animals unless necessary for survival. The aim was clearly defined. Repel aggression, protect the community, establish justice, but not to cause indiscriminate destruction or terror.
That sounds very different from the way extremist groups portray and practice violence today.
Worlds apart. Modern extremist groups completely distort this. They rip verses out of their historical and textual context, ignore all the conditions and prohibitions, and twist the concept to justify their political violence and terrorism. And it's vital to know that the overwhelming majority of Muslim scholars and communities around the world strongly condemn these distortions. They see it as a betrayal of Islamic principles. So understanding jihad correctly shows it's meant as a struggle for what's right, whether internally against ego or externally against actual aggression or oppression, but always within strict ethical limits, not mindless violence.
That clarification is so important, distinguishing the principle from its misuse, which leads us naturally to the third big area, this question of oppression, especially within some Muslim-majority societies. We hear stories, we see reports about, harsh laws or cultural practices affecting women or religious minorities, and these are serious concerns, they raise valid alarms. But again, the core question is, does this oppression come directly from Islam itself? What do the foundational texts actually say about justice, equality, and oppression?
Another really crucial question. And again, we have to look directly at the sources, not just assume that cultural practices automatically reflect religious teaching. And here's a fundamental point. The Qur'an explicitly condemns oppression. The Arabic word is zulm over and over again. It's considered a major sin. There's a very powerful sacred tradition, a hadith Qudsi, where God says, "O my servants, I have forbidden oppression for myself and have made it forbidden amongst you, so do not oppress one another."
Forbidden amongst you, that's unambiguous.
Absolutely. And the Qur'an doesn't just forbid oppression, it actively commands believers to uphold justice, quistan adl, even if it goes against themselves, their parents, or their relatives. It urges people to stand up for the weak and the oppressed, and to actively work to stop oppressors. The emphasis on justice is incredibly strong.
Okay, so if the scripture itself is so strongly against oppression and mandates justice, how do we explain some of the things we do see? Practices that really do seem oppressive, especially towards women or minorities in some places. Where's the disconnect?
That is the central puzzle, isn't it? And the disconnect often lies between the scripture and entrenched cultural practices or political interpretations. Many of the things that cause concern practices, like so-called honor killings, forced marriage, restricting women's education. Many Islamic scholars and Muslim feminists argue very forcefully that these have no solid basis in the Qur'an or authentic prophetic teachings.
So where do they come from?
Often they can be traced back to pre-Islamic, patriarchal tribal customs, or specific local traditions that existed long before Islam arrived in a region. Over time, unfortunately, these cultural norms sometimes got mixed up with religious identity. Or worse, people misused religious language to try and justify practices that actually contradict the core principles of justice and compassion in Islam.
So it's like culture overwriting or distorting the original religious message.
Exactly. And you see this dynamic in virtually all religions and societies throughout history, right? Where cultural biases, political agendas, or simple human failings lead people to act in ways that contradict the highest ideals of their own stated faith.
That makes sense. It's a human story, not just a religious one. So, thinking about Muslims today who are working for change, for women's rights, for minority rights, are they fighting against their religion or are they finding motivation within it?
Overwhelmingly, they see themselves as fighting for the true spirit of their religion, against the cultural distortions or oppressive interpretations. Millions of Muslim men and women across the globe are actively campaigning for justice, equality, and human rights, and they explicitly root their activism in Quranic principles of justice, mercy, and dignity for all. This really highlights the critical gap that can exist between foundational religious teachings and the complex reality of human behavior and cultural norms on the ground. And it pushes us all, I think, to ask that difficult question. How do we learn to distinguish between core religious doctrine and the various cultural or political practices that sometimes claim its name?
That is such a key question, not just for understanding Islam, but really for understanding any belief system or ideology and how it plays out in the real world. Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We started by asking, does Islam itself promote violence and oppression? And what we've seen looking at the history and the texts is, well, it's complicated. Like most things involving humans, history shows us both peace and war, incredible moments of justice and terrible instances of injustice, often within the same civilization. It mirrors the wider human story. But when we look at the foundational text, the Qur'an, the message seems pretty consistent. Peace is the ideal. Defensive fighting is permitted but strictly limited. Forced conversion is banned and justice is demanded while oppression is forbidden.
Precisely. And when we see empires or extremist groups or even individuals acting in ways that violate these core principles, engaging in aggression, harming civilians, forcing conversion, oppressing minorities, then by the standard of the religion itself, these are deviations. They are betrayals of the faith, not expressions of it.
Understanding that distinction feels incredibly important. Separating the actions, the history, the politics from the actual text and its core message. It helps move us beyond just reacting to headlines and fear, doesn't it? Towards a more nuanced understanding. So here's something to maybe leave you, our listeners, thinking about. What really stands out to you when you consider this gap that can exist between the foundational ideals of a religion and the often messy, contradictory actions of people who follow it throughout history? How do we navigate that? It's definitely a complex area and one that invites a lot more thought and learning. And hey, if you found this deep dive helpful, if it sparks some new perspectives for you, you'll really appreciate the kind of information shared over at Mind Expansion Daily. For more insights like this, breaking down complex topics, definitely check out Mind Expansion Daily. And of course, please do like and subscribe right here so you don't miss out on our future deep dives.